So, in the last months, I think many Iranians have been very jealous actually about what has been happening in Iran. I mean, for last 1.5 years, since June 2009, when the demonstrations erupted in Tehran and other cities, people kept up going on the streets for 8 months, confronting the police, the military, and so on, and they didn't get rid of Ahmadinejad, the president, or let alone Khamenei, the supreme leader. And then, you know, the Tunisians did it, and the Egyptians did it, and all kinds of jokes were being told in Iran, actually, kind of, you know, comforting people of why, but also serious questions, you know, but why did it not happen in Iran, and did it happen in the Arab countries? But nevertheless, I think what happened in summer 2009 was really of historical proportions. I mean, for 30 years long, there had been no demonstrations in Iran to first begin with. I mean, there had been some small protests by women rights activists, labor movement activists, student activists, but nothing on that level, on that proportion. I mean, there were really 3 million people in Tehran. And actually, even Khamenei, the supreme leader, had to concede that this actually resembled the revolution of '79. But he said, you know, this is a caricature of the '79 revolution. This is not for real. But I see in that kind of concession of this was really something that made them fear of what is going to happen. They didn't expect something like that would happen. I mean, the demonstrations at the end didn't get rid of Ahmadinejad, but I think they have achieved lots of things. I mean, and first of all, they have delegitimized the Islamic Republic by showing there is a real, vibrant opposition, and they have shown that the oppositional forces in Iran have achieved a critical mass, that they can go onto the street and be a threat for the regime. But having said that, I think the problem in Iran is that we are in a stalemate. I mean, there is the opposition after 1.5 years, and there is the state around the elite of Ahmadinejad and Khamenei and so on. And neither have been able to really crush the others. I mean, the state obviously has the upper hand in this. I mean, they have put Mousavi and Karoubi, the main opposition forces, under house arrest. There have been a wave of arrests. People don't dare to go into the streets like they did previously because of the intimidation and executions and so on. So this is a serious problem. And this actually makes my talk a bit difficult for me. I mean, in the sense of what is going to be next, the next steps. It is very difficult to say because of this stalemate. So it's actually a good idea to take a step back and say, how have we come here? What is the situation in Iran in terms of the structures of power? And I want to go through them on 3 levels: the state, the class structure in Iran, but also the international power structure surrounding Iran, to show how the situation in Iran is in many ways more complex than it was in Egypt or Tunisia. First of all, to begin with the state, we have to realize that the Iranian state was born out of a genuine revolution. I mean, '79 was, according to some historians, the most popular revolution in world history in terms of the number of people participating in this revolution. So, because of this, the state had a lot of legitimacy, I think, certainly in the 1980s, but also because there was the war with Iraq, and many Western countries actually supported Saddam Hussein, and because of that war, the regime could consolidate its power. But in many ways, the nature of the state reflected the contradictions of the revolution itself, because it was at the end led by the clergy. I mean, not from the start. There were very many forces involved in the revolution, but at the end, the forces around Khomeini got the upper hand and created structures in the state that gave them really power. I mean, I would call this almost theocratic structures. The supreme leader himself is at the top of the power. He's the commander of the military and so on. Beneath them you have the a Guardian Council which can select candidates for parliamentary and presidential elections. So these are not elected institutions in the state. But on the other hand, the revolution was supported by the people, and Khomeini had to concede to them democratic institutions as well. So you had the parliament, for which there are regular elections, city councils, the president is chosen in Iran. So there was a real contradiction at the heart of the state between these non-elected institutions and the elected institutions. And one of my arguments is, in the past 30 years, these contradictions have come to a point of a boiling point, and we saw that emerging in the last presidential elections. That part of the regime actually said, we have to, get rid of these genuinely democratic features of the state and militarize our power in order to maintain our position. So we have been seeing a shift from the democratic institutions towards non-elected autocratic institutions in Iran, mainly around Supreme Leader Khamenei, but also the Revolutionary Guards, which are also a very important economic force in Iran. This brings me to the second level of structural power in Iran, and those are the social classes. Because, in a way, if we look to a state in social terms, any state is underpinned by a class alliance, which Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, called a historic bloc. And the historic bloc that came out of the Iranian Revolution was a combination of the clergy, the traditional bourgeoisie and middle class in Iran, the bazaris, the merchants, but also the urban poor and the Iran's working class, who actually defeated the Shah by going on strikes. So this was the historical bloc that emerged out of the revolution. And to maintain this historical bloc, the state actually created a populist contract by having a level of welfare programs, wealth redistribution, expansion of education and healthcare. So for a time, they could actually bind the working class and the lower classes to the clergy and the merchants. But I would argue that from the 1990s, because of Iran's economic problems after the war, they chose for other path. I mean, this was also a path many autocratic regimes took in the world, neoliberal adjustment programs. And they tried to privatize the economy, liberalize it, give more power to the market. And this started to really alienate the lower classes and the working class from the state. And actually in the early 1990s, you had some uprisings in Iranian cities, in 7 Iranian cities, against rising prices and so on. So this has become a real problem for the Islamic Republic, this unraveling of the historical bloc. And nothing has actually substituted it yet. And I would say one solution that they have been looking for is this way of privatization. They are privatizing many, many companies, but in a way that they are actually giving it to their own people of the regime, whether it be the Revolutionary Guards or people coming from the bureaucracy, are buying up these privatized companies. So there is a kind of pseudo privatization. But I would actually say this is what happened in Russia after 1989, the fall of state capitalism in those countries, the nomenclatura taking on the role of a private bourgeoisie. This is actually what these autocratic regimes, and partly I think this has been happening in Egypt as well, in which the military has been buying assets and so on. The regimes are seeking to create a social basis for themselves. So this is, I think, what is happening in Iran at the moment, but it is a very tricky game for them, of course. And then again, this is not a stable situation. And on the third level, we have the international politics. And this is very important because I think, because of Iranian state's opposition during the revolution after it to imperialist powers in the region, it also gained legitimacy in the eyes of many Iranian people, because the U.S. had been always intervening in Iranian politics. They were kicked out with the revolution, after the revolution, and this created lots of goodwill among the population. And also the recent failures of the U.S. in the region, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, has paradoxically actually strengthened the Iranian state. But on the other hand, I think the Iranian state has used this opposition against imperialism, which is really being supported by the Iranian people, but has perverted it into creating kind of isolationism instead of a genuine opposition against imperialism. So I will end on this note by saying, if you look to these three levels of structural power, I think a very complex picture emerges, because unlike, I think, in Egypt, where in the last months you had the whole population standing against the state, in Iran the society itself is much more divided. There is a section of the population supporting still the Iranian regime. I mean, I believe it's a minority, but it's a significant minority which supports Ahmadinejad because they believe, for instance, Rafsanjani, who is a supporter of the Green Movement, he's one of the richest people in Iran, actually, and many people in Iran really hate him. And so this creates lots of tensions. How can it that some people like him are supporting the Green Movement? So in the eyes of the lower classes in Iran, there are in a way, things have to crystallize much more out, these tensions, before I think a revolution we have seen in Tunisia and Egypt can emerge in Iran. But I think Iran is in that process. The legitimacy and the power of the state is eroding, and the oppositional forces are gaining power. But I will come to that back in the second half, talking about resistance strategies. Thank you.